All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Puget Systems podcast. This is our big roundup for the hardware launch of the AMD Threadripper PRO 5000 WX series. I like these ones. These are a lot of fun. We're going to go over our performance testing results, a little bit of the background of this kind of crazy launch. As the last few hardware launches have been really crazy from everybody, so it's not picking on AMD or anything. This has just been a very strange year. But yeah, I'm really excited. We'll go around the circle. Everybody introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. Matt?
Sure. So on our labs team I guess this is the labs podcast, huh? So I'm on the labs team. I focus on the video and photo industry. So think anything Adobe and then similar applications like Blackmagic, Davinci Resolve, those kind of applications. So in this case, how Threadripper Pro behaves in all of those applications, because in some it's like a great product for it, in others it's like, no, you wouldn't really ever use it, but hey, we'll test it anyway, even though it doesn't make sense, because sometimes, especially in like things like Photoshop, like you might not care about it as like your primary, but like any video editor is going to use Photoshop, so hey, it's good to check to see how, make sure there's no weird things that come up with it. So we still do the full gamut, but that's my specialty, is the video and photo side.
All right, I'm Kelly. I'm the 3D side. I do 3D modeling, animation, rendering, and game development. That includes like virtual production and all that stuff with Unreal Engine. So I'll be testing today V-Ray, C4D, Blender, and Unreal Engine.
And I'm William. I'm no longer on the labs team, used to be, but these days I actually just put together the configurations on our website. So I take all the good work those guys do and actually put it into products you can buy from us, and information on pages so that you can figure out what to buy if you're building your own or whatnot as well.
Oh, cool. And Kelly, you mentioned Blender. That's a new one for us, right?
Yep. Yeah. We're just getting our toes wet with Blender, just using their rendering benchmark that you can download from their website. So you can compare your systems to what the scores will show you in a bit.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. The hard thing with those rendering ones is always like, all right, that's the rendering engine, but what about everything else? Like, I think Blender is probably the worst, because like Blender, like it's a full-on modeling simulation video editor. Like you can do anything in Blender.
It does tons of weird things.
Wow, that's cool though. Right on. I guess we'll start at the beginning, right? Kind of what's different about this one compared to last gen. I mean, they're consolidating their product line and all that stuff. I admit that I'm not 100% like super up to date on all this stuff. It's been a little confusing to try and keep up on. So I think, William, that's more a question for you, I think.
Yeah, I can certainly start it out. So this is, as you said, the Threadripper Pro 5000 WX series, which is the second generation of what AMD has called their Threadripper Pro line. They had the Threadripper for several years, for 3 generations, 1000, 2000, 3000 series. Mm-hmm. And then when the 3000 series Threadripper Pro or Threadrippers came out, a little bit later, they came out with a Threadripper Pro, which is a similar idea. Like they're both aimed at higher core count audiences, folks that need more PCI Express lanes, memory and memory channels, things like that. Mm-hmm. But Threadripper Pro is basically the next step above normal Threadripper. They had similar core counts. They all went up to 64 cores, but Threadripper Pro had 8 memory channels as opposed to 4 on the normal Threadripper, and an increased number of PCI Express lanes, and of course cost more as well. It's actually under the hood based on their EPYC server line of processors, EPYC with a Y. And then, so we had Threadripper 3000 and Threadripper Pro 3000 WX technically for a while. And then Threadripper sort of fell off. They didn't update that when they updated the Ryzen processors from 3000 to 5000 series, which was they went from to a Zen 3 architecture under the hood of the Ryzen chips last year, or maybe even 2 years ago now, I can't remember. They never updated Threadripper, and now they're updating Threadripper Pro. It's the same deal. It's basically the equivalent to Ryzen moving from the 3000 to 5000 series. It's the Zen 2 to Zen 3 architecture move for this series, but there is no more going to be Threadripper. At least that seems to be what AMD is saying. They're kind of consolidating everything into Threadripper Pro, which sucks in terms of price because that kind of cut out that middle section, but Intel's done the same thing. Intel had Core X, and Xeon, and Core X, while it's still technically available, is several generations out of date now. And hardly, I can't think of anything where it actually makes sense, because you can get up to 24 cores in Core, and you can go way higher in Xeon, and Threadripper or Core X only went up to 18. So Intel's basically effectively dropping that segment. It seems like AMD has now officially dropped that segment. They've said they're consolidating everything into the Pro series. So that kind of sucks, but these are still amazingly powerful processors. The only downside really is the price and the size of the motherboards. And I'm hoping that we see some movement there. Right now, all of the boards that we've found that were any good for this are big EATX, or what do they call it, CEB or something? I can't remember, the SSB, some whatever the really large boards are. And that's because part of the point of these things is 8 memory channels, so a minimum of 8 memory slots, or potentially 16 on some boards, and a whole ton of PCI Express lanes. And the only way to fit all of that on a board is to have a fairly large motherboard. So those are kind of the downsides. They're expensive, and you have to have a big motherboard, at least currently. But performance-wise, again, it's very much like that Ryzen jump, if everyone remembers that from a year or two ago. The core counts didn't increase. It still goes up to 64 cores, but the performance per core jumps around 15%, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but in that ballpark. So you see quite a substantial improvement in a lot of workflows. And it pretty much at this point beats Intel for most things, except for workloads that are really specially designed for some of the instruction sets that Intel supports or something. So it's a really powerful high-end CPU if you're doing high core count stuff, high memory or high memory bandwidth stuff where there's a lot of stuff going in and out of memory, or you need a ton of PCI Express lanes. So anything where you want like more than 2 GPUs, or if you need a ton of M.2 SSDs or things like that. Those are kind of the places it excels.
Yeah, and I even want to kind of reiterate, I think, a few of those points. Because, man, was a lot of confusion over the last maybe 6 months of like whether there's going to be new Threadripper CPUs or if it was all going to be Threadripper Pro. Because like someone from AMD would get on to like some live stream or something and say one thing, and then they'd say something else, and then this, and then that. And they finally put up a blog post, an official blog post. This was just last week. You can even switch it if you want, but it's a little bit hard to find. But if you can find it, where they say a few things in there that they finally are like officially clarifying a lot of the waters. One was that they're saying that system integrators are going to be able to start selling in July 2022, and that includes like us. So we're going to be able to start selling these new Threadripper Pros in July of this year. So I mean, could be as soon as a few days. I mean, yeah, July is there. You know, I don't think the exact date is publicly known, so we'll just leave it as July. And that's kind of just, it's been kind of a wonky launch. It was similar with the 3000 WX line, where Lenovo had exclusive availability at first. So they've been able to sell since March, technically. And now finally, I think Dell said like a couple of weeks ago that now they can. And then starting in July, finally, we're going to be able to. So that was one thing. And then a DIY community later this year is also, I think, something good. Now, what that means, probably December 24th. Who knows?
Christmas launch. Just kidding.
Yeah. They also pointed out, where is here? They're saying going forward, Threadripper platform will use a common infrastructure. We have one set of Threadripper Pro processors to choose from because they're unifying the Threadripper and Threadripper Pro line. So this is finally confirmation that there is not going to be more Threadrippers. And I know a lot of people were pretty peeved about that because they got a TRX 40 chipset board, motherboard with Threadripper, and they were expecting to be able to do, 1 or even 2 generations of CPU upgrades without having to change their motherboard and the whole rest of the platform. And now it's finally coming out that nope, you can't. If you want to do the next gen, Threadripper or Threadripper Pro, you've got to go up to the WRX 80, which, like William said, is expensive on CPUs and very expensive on motherboards as well. And the motherboards are huge. I do really, really hope, I mean, this is not based on any insider knowledge at all, so I can speculate as much as I want, that now that they are unified, that we're going to start seeing at least ATX boards, if not micro ATX, because there's a lot of workflows out there where you want a lot of CPU horsepower. Like you want the 32 or the 64 core, but 4 memory channels is fine. One or two, PCIe slots, for like 2 GPUs or like a GPU and a deck link or something is plenty. And honestly, a lot of my workflows are that way. Like, give me a 32 core Threadripper and like an RTX 3080 or 3090. Done. You don't need a giant EATX chassis. So I think that's the two other things. They did mention a few things like CPU overclocking. Some boards will support it. That I'm not as a fan of. I'm not a huge fan of overclocking anymore.
Yeah.
The only other thing I was going to tack on, William, to what you were saying, like you mentioned the move to Zen 3. The only other thing that I can find is they bumped the maximum turbo clocks up a little bit. Now they are all 4.5 gigahertz. So
for the single
that's up
core,
from,
yeah.
I think the old one was 4.3. So like
On
that's
the
like
old
a
one,
5% bump.
It was different for each one. The lower core count ones had higher single core max clock speeds, which was one of the things I think they'd gotten feedback. I remember this in some sort of meeting somewhere. So hopefully it's not NDA or anything, but they'd gotten feedback that there were times when, yeah, even if you have 64 cores, if you're just running one, you want it to be as fast. You don't want to be compromising and getting a slower performance than you would if you had a $2,000 less expensive processor. So they made sure all of the single core boosts were the same. The full core boost. So if you have 64 cores all going, that's still going to be slower than 32 cores all going on the 32 core model. But when you're just using one core, they should be the same.
Yeah, and that's the complicated thing, I think, is very rarely are you going to use just one core. Even if you're using a entirely single-threaded application, well, Windows is running, Chrome is running, StreamYard is running, YouTube's running. So your system's not actually going to be able to clock to that single core speed all the time. And I see that a lot in like my stuff. And I know even Kelly and some of your stuff, like it's a very lightly threaded application. And yet there's still a tangible benefit to going with the lower core count Threadripper Pros because, like, yes, they have the same maximum turbo clock, but the higher core count CPUs have a lower base clock, and there's not a table as far as I know of like where the boosts are because it's going to depend on like cooling and your motherboard and power delivery and all this other complicated stuff. But essentially, you have your I'm going to do this backwards so it's right on camera. You have your base clock is down here and your maximum turbo, and it'll fall somewhere in between those for most applications. And the middle is going to be very different for one CPU versus another. Like if you're using 4 cores, yeah, the 24 core is going to be a good chunk faster than the 64 core. And like you might not get that just by looking at the paper specs.
And that is one other thing worth mentioning, just for anybody that is really familiar with the 3000WX line. The CPU lineup itself is slightly different. They still both have 64 and 32 cores, but there's a 24 core now. And then there technically are 16 and 12 core models, but those are exclusive, as far as I know, to OEMs like Dell and Lenovo. So for most folks, it'll be 24, 32, 64, which makes sense because Ryzen tops out at 16. So if you really don't need those extra cores or the extra memory bandwidth or PCI Express lanes, you go to Ryzen, you got 16 and lower, and then Threadripper Pro will be 24 and up. And also, I forgot to mention, it uses the same chipset as the previous gen, which is really nice. So if you did have an existing system and want to boost performance by, well, what Matt and Kelly will be talking about here in terms of percentages, you can just pull the CPU out. Well, BIOS update first, probably, then pull the CPU out, pop the new one in, and go ahead. So that's pretty cool, which also is really nice on our end in terms of product line.
I think we just lost Williams.
Yeah.
Like,
Your audio just cut out
let's talk
there.
about how it's really.
Well,
let's just say how it's really good for a product line because it makes things simpler.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's what he was saying.
Yeah, support makes it a little bit easier because that way if someone in a year the CPU dies, which would be rare, we can slot in a 5000 series instead of 3000.
Yep.
Or they just want an upgrade. I mean, that happens quite a bit. I mean,
Yeah, so they just want to
as we'll
upgrade.
talk about here with performance in a little bit, some of these are pretty big upgrades to performance. So some workflows, some customers, I'm sure we're going to be getting systems back just for a CPU upgrade. Because man, a lot of our customers, like it totally depends on what you're doing and how valuable time is. But for a lot of our customers and a lot of the workflows we specifically target, like even at the cost of these CPUs, being, I don't know what they are. Hopefully we'll come back and see, I'll be able to say pricing, but $2, $3, $4, $5, whatever $1,000, like that's nothing compared to the cost of a person. Like if you can make a person 10% more efficient, like, okay, well, that $5,000 investment is paid for in like 4 months.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's,
And the prices are a little higher with this generation than the 3000. Not dramatically so, but the 32 and 64 each went up a few $100s compared to the previous gen. So these are not cheap processors, and they're quite a bit more than the normal Threadrippers for folks that were accustomed to those. These are several $1,000s more than that, unfortunately.
yeah. And the last thing before we get into performance, I'm sure other people have things, and if anyone has a question, you'll toss them in and we'll try to answer any questions. But the other thing I wanted to talk about is like their main competition here is the Xeon W line. And it's interesting because Xeon W, first of all, pricing on those is very similar. I was surprised at how similar they are compared to the Xeon W, the Threadripper Pros. It's kind of hard to talk pricing at this level because a lot of it is like they're not really available to DIYers. Like you kind of can find them on like Amazon or Newegg or whatever, but like you don't know what that pricing is real or if someone's doing weird stuff with it. And even like our pricing, like it fluctuates, quite a bit. It depends on how much you buy and all this stuff. So it's hard to compare pricing directly, but they're in the same ballpark. But the Xeon W, they don't have a 64 core model. They have a 38. That's a weird CPU. We didn't even test it this time because it often gives like absolutely terrible performance because if a program isn't coded properly to handle CPUs that have more than 32 cores or 64 threads, things get really wonky. And when you're just a little over that limit, it seems to make it even wonkier. So we didn't even test the 38 core, I think, this time around. And Xeon W does have the same number of memory channels. It has the same technical 2 terabyte RAM limit. But it only has 64 PCIe lanes, which is probably enough. Like we don't do more than triple GPU anymore,
Right.
like, except very rarely. So that's whatever 16 times 3 is. So we're not using 64 lanes, but with how much more like M.2 NVMe drives are, just having 128 lanes on Threadripper Pro just means you don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
Which is nice. I like when you don't have to think about whether you're going to be able to do something or not. It's just like the answer is just yes.
No slowing down PCI slots, no killing sated ports and all that.
Yeah. No like having to be like, oh, well, if I use this, then it'll disable this, or if I do that, it'll disable that. It's just like, you've got enough. Don't worry.
I went to visit a customer who's using a Threadripper Pro, and they have 2 GPUs, a deck link card, quadro-sync card, and something else. And they needed to move like where everything was located for the rack system so that way they could have ports at a specific spot and stuff like that. And that board allows you to like, you can put anything in any slot. It's not like you only have 2 X16 slots. You have 8 to choose from and you can slot them how you want. And
that's great.
So it's kind of nice for that.
Yeah.
And I guess that board actually is upside down. So like PCIe slot 1 is technically at the bottom.
Oh,
is that the board we sell?
Yeah.
I can bring that picture of it.
Different manufacturers seem to name slots from the bottom to the top or top to bottom.
Yeah. So it just impacted how they were using, because they're using NVLink, and it just kind of messed with that a little bit. Otherwise, it's not a problem.
But yeah, it's just nice that you're right. Like all of these slots are just like 16.
Yeah.
There's no joke about how big it is too.
Yeah.
Jeez, man.
Oh yeah. Well, and I think the last thing with Threadripper Pro versus Xeon W, so ignoring performance because we'll talk about that, is a weird one actually. Is coolers. For whatever reason, it feels like CPU coolers on Xeon W are just not there. Threadripper Pro, like we have a nice beefy Noctua 140 millimeter, big heatsink, big fan, nice and cool and everything. I think the best cooler we found for Xeon W is it dual 92? Is that it, William, or is it dual? It can't be dual 80.
It's some super micro thing. I think I can't remember what it is. It's not particularly impressive.
Like it does the job. But
I think part of that comes from, if I'm remembering right, I think AMD uses the same socket mounting for the cooler on Threadripper Pro that they did on Threadripper. So there was sort of an ecosystem already of existing products, or it was close enough that there wasn't much adaptation needed. Whereas ZNW is kind of a really niche product. It hasn't been around super long, and people weren't.
it's also more
going out of their way to
complicated
make
mounting.
coolers for it. Yeah,
Because ZNW, you have to put the CPU in a plastic tray on the heatsink and then into the board.
Yeah.
It's not like a clip socket that we're used to with like normal Intel CPUs.
So scary to install. I hate it.
It's
even
super
Threadrippers
scary.
are a little weird, in all fairness.
That
Threadrippers
little-
go in a plastic thing, and then that slides in and then lowers down. So that was a little weird, but yeah, the Xeon one.
other weird thing about the Threadripper Pro is that the cooler is 90 degrees to the board, so it's blowing up instead of back. So it looks a little weird, but I mean, as long as you have a correct case, it's fine.
Yeah, because I don't even know if they turned the socket. There might not even be room on a lot of these boards, like right now, where they're trying to put 8 PCIe slots. I don't know if there would actually be room to have like a 140 millimeter fan, be up and down so it can vent out the back. There might not be.
I think that's probably why it's in that orientation. It would just block. Yeah, it would block like the top PCI slot or two.
I mean, our server chassis has the cooler for that is the regular orientation, so it blows front to back.
But it's a lot smaller.
Yeah. But then you have just massive fans blowing everywhere, and those are usually going in air-conditioned, climate-controlled special rooms. So,
yeah.
I want to grab this one question, and I'll try and get to some of the other stuff that was asked, but we're going to answer a lot of them here in just a minute as we cover the performance testing. But Bill Dawson on YouTube asked, does Threadripper Pro have Thunderbolt 4?
So the board that we're carrying does not. It's one of those where technically that's kind of an Intel spec, the Threadripper or Thunderbolt stuff. But they've either allowed or somehow certain manufacturers have gotten around that and put Thunderbolt on some AMD boards. Like I want to say the Ryzen board we're carrying right now, I think has Thunderbolt. But it really seems to be a manufacturer thing, whether the manufacturer of the motherboard implements that or has some sort of agreement that lets them. And it looks like, I think there are some boards out there that do. And that is one of the things we take into account when we're selecting what motherboards to carry is ports. And we love to include Thunderbolt when we can. But there's also other things like reliability, our relationship with the individual manufacturers in terms of being able to get support if something goes wrong, BIOS updates, RMA things. There's a lot that goes into it. That one we're currently using, I believe, is an Asus board. Somebody yell at me if I'm wrong, but
that's correct.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So that particular one doesn't have it, but there may well be some boards out there on the market that do if you need that.
There's a follow-up comment that Tulios Tech, he says, yeah, the ASRock WRX80 creator motherboard has dual Thunderbolt 4. So that's pretty cool.
I think that one is also an ATX board. It's just, it's ASRock. So we didn't use it.
Yeah, the hard part with Thunderbolt is that it's probably the most problematic motherboard feature in existence. Thunderbolt is just, there's so many moving parts to it. Like you have the data, you have the video side of things, and everything needs to be correct on the motherboard side, the BIOS, the firmware, the Thunderbolt controller, the cables, the device that you're using has to have the right support. And if any one of those is they didn't quite do it the way they should have, it just doesn't work. So we actually have to do a lot of testing. I think it's better now than it was a few years ago, but we have to do a lot of testing to make sure that Thunderbolt is going to work. And sometimes that's the difference between we can carry a board and we can't is, well, Thunderbolt's not up to spec. So it's, it's a pain. So that's my caveat when someone finds a board and it's yeah, this one should do it. It's yeah, it might, but just be prepared to test that out, as soon as you get your system built or you get a system in, make sure it's working. And if it's not, well, it's probably the motherboard, some part of that chain they didn't do quite right. And so
that definitely has gotten better. Thunderbolt 1 and 2 was a nightmare for us. 3 is when it seemed to start to get better. And Thunderbolt 4, the boards that we have with it, I think it's been quite a bit better. But there is also not backward compatibility. You go, I think Thunderbolt 4 works with 3 and 4 devices, but not generation 1 and 2 or something along those lines. If I'm remembering right, so you have to be a little bit careful. If you've got really old Thunderbolt devices, they don't necessarily work. I like USB better. I know some people need the speed of Thunderbolt, but man.
Well, USB, what is it? Isn't it pretty close now to
3.2 Gen
USB-C?
A X4.
Yeah, right.
It's certainly
3.3Z.
We have.
Yeah, I think it's always a little behind Thunderbolt, but
there was a Gigabyte board we had because the USB-C and Thunderbolt are the same port now. That this Gigabyte board did not offer Thunderbolt, but most Thunderbolt devices worked in it, and they just they did all the work to do it. They just didn't want to pay for the licensing. So, and then they didn't have to say, yeah, it's gonna work. They'd be like, try it, see if it works. If it does, cool. If not, we don't say we support it. So
That's the
manufacturer
one
always
part
come
of
up with their own thing.
a unified port. That's the downside. Is well, what is it? Is it USB? Is it Thunderbolt? I don't know.
Plug it in and find
That's
out.
the one. I like having unified ports. If everything works, perfect world, I'd love just everything to be just USB-C. Just everything. But I know that's not really possible.
All right. I guess we move on into performance. Yeah. We'll just go round the clock,
I can start off.
Sure.
At least I was just going to go through our published article, so if people want to look at things in more details, and I know my stuff is the first in the list, so I guess I can just go first.
Yeah,
can imagine how that happened.
I mean, those are the softwares that we've covered the longest too, so it does make sense.
Yeah, I think that was the big, and we wanted. I felt like it was good to end on the ones that showed the biggest performance gains, which was a lot of Kelly's stuff. So end on a high note. So, so if you're interested in this, I mean, you can go to our our website. If you go to publications articles, I think it's the most recent article right now, so it's really easy to find. And we did something a little bit different this time around. So there's a bunch of info in here and stuff. Is we have one or sometimes two charts for each of these applications, and then we talk about it, and then we have a more in-depth article if you wanted to go in there where we dived into a lot of my stuff. I had to look at different Windows power profiles because I was getting different performance, and I dived into more specific things. So there is an extra layer in there if you want to look at all that stuff. So I'm going to start off with Premiere Pro. It's an interesting one. It's not huge performance gains. So if you look at the old Threadripper, whoa, that's the wrong thing. I'm trying to use a
whiteboard
thing. Like a whiteboardy thing. So the old Threadrippers, we're somewhere around here. New Threadrippers are up there. So they are slightly faster in terms of overall performance in After Effects. Nothing huge and major. But they're a nice little performance gain. I will mention that this is looking at overall performance, and some of the stuff we test, it's mostly using the GPU. Actually, is using the GPU for hardware decoding, or it's just anything is really going to be able to do it. So it's fine. In the cases where it's heavier things like Red Raw, it should even apply for RA Raw and Cinema DNG, those heavy codecs. It'll be a bigger benefit. So I think those were I don't remember, 15 or 20% faster. So not massive, but some people will see a benefit. I will also mention up here, there's the 12900K is actually at the top of our performance. We threw that CPU into a lot of our testing because we wanted to show okay, well, this is how it compares to a consumer grade CPU,
Sure.
Much less expensive. So how much performance are you going to get over it, by investing in Threadripper Pro? And that's really, really high. It's kind of an artifact of how good it is at handling H.264 and HEVC media. So very specific kinds of media that Intel QuickSync can decode. It's just super good for that. So it kind of skews the overall results. It's definitely not faster than Threadripper Pro in a lot of the workflows that you would probably be investing in Threadripper Pro for. If you're going to be spending $10,000, $15,000 on a workstation, you're probably not just using H.264 420 8-bit media. You're probably working with RAW or something like that. So that's the main thing I kind of wanted to point out there is that yes, there's that 12900K is amazing for some workflows in Premiere Pro. Probably not for these high end where you would actually invest in workstation stuff. I'll also mention lastly too that versus like Xeon W, so like top Xeon W is down here. The equivalent Threadripper Pro is up here. You know, that's a small gain. I think it's like 10 or 15%. So it's not massive, but this is also using the high performance Windows profile. If you don't use that until Xeon W takes a pretty big hit, so you have to be like okay with your CPU not throttling ever. I think the minimum power processor state is by default like 5%, and with a high performance profile, it's 100%. So that's kind of like an added benefit, I would say, with Threadripper Pro is you don't have to mess with power profiles as much. So you get that performance without having to do weird, it's not even weird tweaks, but tweaks that are going to make your system a little bit louder, use more power and things like that. We also did After Effects. After Effects is an interesting one too, because we, like, if we had this chart a year ago, it would not look like this at all. They added a new feature called multi-frame rendering that makes After Effects, basically turned it from a single-threaded application into a moderately threaded application, I would call it. I wouldn't call it like a highly threaded application, but it's moderately threaded. And so the new Threadripper Pros are great. We have something that's better than a consumer CPU in terms of like raw overall performance in After Effects. It's not a big difference between Threadripper Pro and like the 12900K, but versus Xeon W or the old Threadripper Pros, down these guys, it's a pretty good performance bump. I think often in the range of like 30% overall. But also, that's overall performance, and some of the things we test are kind of lightweight, because a lot of things people do in After Effects are not like particularly heavyweight. So we also have a specific one that's looking at just performance in like very complicated setups, and this is where you're going to see it. So again, it's kind of that kind of situation where like if you have the budget to invest in Threadripper Pro, this is probably more what you're going to be doing rather than like what the overall score is that we show. And in this case, like that's a big performance bump. Like going from a score of 200-ish to up to 300, like that's a 50% performance gain. Like that's massive. So yeah, these new Threadripper Pros for like high-end After Effects work, man, they're amazing. I think we're gonna get quite a few people either sending in systems for CPU upgrades or like just buying new systems, because to say that in After Effects you can have a 50% performance bump, like that's huge. That is absolutely massive.
Yeah, wow.
So yeah, that's gonna like, I'm sure this will turn into a lot of workstation sales for us, and that's great. And they're gonna be happy because they're gonna have like their return on investment is gonna be like a month. So that's just all around amazing.
I want to interject a little quick. I just think it's kind of interesting to see that the 24 core Threadripper Pro is at the top. And is, especially with like the multi-frame rendering thing, is that because of the higher clock speed for that, do you think?
Yeah, so if you look at this one, where like this is where MFR, multi-frame rendering, is really able to like stretch its legs and really do its thing. This is where you see like 64 cores on top, then 32, then 24. So in those kind of workflows, it kind of is more about cores. But you're right. If we look back at the overall score, which again includes some lighter things, more like average workflows, you're right. The 24 cores at the top, and then 32, and then 64. It's actually more apparent with the previous generation, where we had like the 32 cores here and the 64 cores way down at the bottom. Like it's the worst. But yeah, it's because MFR can do a lot, but in some situations it's only making After Effects moderately threaded. It's just like it's bringing it up to the level of like Premiere Pro, rather than the level of like a lot of like Kelly's things that are like CPU rendering, which is like perfect scaling. So yeah, it's very much, you have to make sure you're getting the right processor, not just like throwing money at it, because especially the 64 core, there are quite a few times where it is not going to be the fastest for specific workflows. Some it is, some it's not. Generally, going from the 24 to the 32, like you don't often see too much of a performance like degradation. Like here, the difference is it's a few percent. It's margin of error probably. So you're really not like hurting yourself by going with the 32 in this case, but you might not always get a benefit. So definitely, that's where like this kind of testing just is invaluable. Like you can look at Cinebench scores, you can look at gaming results all day, but it's not going to tell you anything except for Cinebench and gaming. Let's see what else on here. Davinci Resolve Studios, another interesting one. Davinci Resolve uses the GPU a lot more, but the CPU is still pretty heavy. And what's interesting is that these results are all like the same. Like all three of the CPUs we tested were very similar across most of the things we test, and I think it comes down to a couple of different points. One, there is a lot of things that are very single-threaded actually in DaVinci Resolve, or a lot of the fusion-based compositions, VFX, motion graphics. In which case, the fact that they all have the same maximum turbo makes them all kind of the same. And two, GPU is used a whole lot more, so a lot of times the GPU is the limiting factor. But all that really means is that, like, yes, we're seeing a small performance bump over the previous generation here, same over Intel, but it's not as big of a change here with DaVinci Resolve. And so unlike After Effects, where I'm sure we're going to be getting a lot of people coming back to us for new systems or upgrades, people that are DaVinci Resolve users, probably not quite as much. It's just the Zen 3 stuff and the increased turbo clocks don't seem to affect things as much in DaVinci Resolve.
Yeah.
What else is in here? We include Photoshop because it's a secondary application, but not really much to talk about here. I don't really want to spend a lot of time. 12900K or Ryzen is probably going to be faster than these, but they should be. That's what they're really designed for, is lightly threaded things. I guess the only thing to note is that, like, there is a good performance gain over previous generation, so, like, that's great. If you use, for your After Effects and you use Photoshop quite a bit as well, which you probably do, hey, it's good. It's good. There's no weird things. Because we've definitely seen in the past weird things where, like, yeah, this CPU is great for this, but the secondary application that, like, everyone uses is absolute garbage with it. And so it's good to see that that's not the case. And then the last one we looked at is Lightroom Classic. Good performance gains here. I would say the biggest thing is, so we divide our tests into active and passive tasks. So active tasks is like you're clicking on things, you're dragging things, like you're trying to do things in real time. And then passive tasks is like where you click go and you wait. So exporting, importing, generating previews, those kind of things. An active task, a lot of CPUs are actually very similar these days because they all have very high single-threaded performance. So those are all great. They're still going to be beat out by, like, a consumer-level CPU, just like Fusion and things like that. The passive tasks are where they get a nice performance bump versus previous gen. What is that, like a 15% performance bump, which, it's not going to be, light years faster. And honestly, people who are doing photography like Lightroom Classic, this is well beyond where I think a lot of people are going to be able to justify the cost.
You're going to be hard pressed to spend more on your computer than you do on your camera.
It's and also things like photography. I think more and more as, like, laptops are becoming more powerful, and even like iPads. Now they have the Lightroom, just the normal Lightroom version that's a cloud-based, storage and things like that. I think more and more people are kind of moving towards doing things on site or while they're on the go with photography. So I think we're even seeing a little bit lower like workstation sales for Lightroom Classic as well. So, and I think it's just because of that, because photography, like the difficulty of doing, like, processing photography is not going at the same rate as video or game dev or virtual production. So we're just seeing more people move to mobile, I think. So I think that's all of my stuff. So I'll just go through that stuff. So overall, decent gains in most applications of around, I want to say, like 10 or 15%. And then in some specific workflows, like up to like 50%. So, like, it can be absolutely massive in some cases, but a lot of other ones, fairly minor. It just depends on the application.
Right on. Right.
You want to go through your stuff, Kelly? I don't know if there's any questions we should jump in there if there was any, Houston.
There was actually one that might be a little interesting, but more toward Don, I think. Does Threadripper still run better when using Linux versus Windows?
That might be a reference. The old, I think it was the first or maybe second gen Threadripper had some issues with Windows early on in terms of just performing properly. And I don't remember what it was. But yeah, we didn't even carry, I think, the first gen Threadrippers for a long time because of some weird issues and stuff surrounding them, not just performance-wise, but there were some other things too. No, as far as I'm aware, there's no issues like that anymore. I mean, as you can see here, they're running great. There might be some things where, like, in certain cases, Linux might have less overhead than Windows does. So if you had an identical benchmark in both, sometimes you'll see a little bit different performance just because of what's going on in the background and how the thread schedulers work and stuff. But in general, no, there's no problems with using Threadripper on Windows these days.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of another thing. So something else we're working on right now, we're in the middle of testing, is Windows 10 versus Windows 11. Because all of this testing is with Windows 11. And technically, last time we did testing when Windows 11 came out, Windows 11 was almost always a little bit slower than Windows 10. So right now we're refreshing that testing, seeing if things have changed, and we're including these. So it'll be interesting to see, whether like different versions of Windows will make a difference. But yeah, I agree with Linux. Maybe on some app-specific stuff. I mean, a lot of my stuff, Adobe doesn't support Linux. Resolve does. Last time I tested, Windows was actually a little bit faster than Linux. So the reason why people use Linux for something like Davinci Resolve isn't for performance usually. They might think it is, but it's not actually. It's just because there's no annoying Windows updates with Linux. You can lock it down and it won't change.
Yeah, I had some issues with the V-Ray in Windows 11 on the 64 core, but that the 64 core performed better on Windows 10 than it did 11. But that was an update that V-Ray posted that fixed it, not Windows.
Huh.
So it was just, yeah. But speaking of V-Ray, V-Ray saw quite a huge improvement to rendering scores. The neighborhood of like 25% over the previous generation, about 40% if you're looking at comparing it to Xeon at the same core level, like the Threadripper Pro 32 core versus the Xeon 32 core is just completely night and day. Like V-Ray really liked these CPUs. It's heavily threaded. It also likes the IPC improvements, and not a whole lot to say about V-Ray with this one. It's just a lot faster.
It's good.
C4D, not quite as dramatic. Still in the neighborhood of 20% faster over generation. And like even the Threadripper Pro 24 core is faster than Xeon's 32 core. It's
decent amount.
Yeah, these are like if you're doing CPU rendering, these Threadripper is an absolute beast, and there's just no real comparison. We go to the next slide, the single core. This is where it gets a little more interesting. So as Matt said, we kind of threw in a 12900K just for reference to like what your other option is. Also, Cinebench, our recommended system is a 12900. So we wanted to show like, yeah, these are faster, but this is why we're still recommending the 12900. So for pure single threaded task, which is modeling, animation, cloth simulations, all that kind of stuff, that's all single threaded or very lightly threaded workflows. Like these do get a decent boost. I think it's about 15%, if I remember correctly, 10%, something like that. So you do get a nice boost if you are doing modeling and rendering on the same machine, but it's still not as fast as a 12900K. So you just kind of have to like balance exactly what your workflow is in 3D with these different CPUs. Like how much are you doing CPU based rendering? How much fluid simulations are you doing? Those are all multi-threaded, want high core counts, versus are you just doing modeling animation and then using GPU rendering or sending off to a rendering node somewhere else to do all your rendering and then figure out exactly where you want to sit on there. This was kind of the inspiration for including the 12900. It was to like, felt weird to say, oh, yeah, CPU is great, even though we don't recommend it for this workflow. And this is why, because it's not even close to the 12900K.
Yeah.
And then jumping down to Blender.
Yeah, the
new one. So yeah, again, saw nice improvements. This the Blender benchmark is only CPU rendering. for the Blender benchmark. It doesn't take into consideration 3D modeling, kind of like the Cinebench single core does. But for CPU rendering, saw, what did I say, 15% increase, pretty much across the board. There's no comparison for the 24 core because there was no 24 last time, but you compare the 24 core to the Xeons, it's still killing both of them. It's like 20% faster than the 24 core Xeon, and like
More than that.
Yeah. If you go to the full analysis, you can see the exact breakdown of all that. I forget all the numbers right now. And but yeah, it's, again, there's no match for CPU rendering. And then because Blender's benchmark is only rendering, kind of take a look at the Cinebench score for the same thing for modeling, class simulations. Blender has this new thing called geometry nodes. It's a procedural modeling tool that they have that I need to dive into. I've been receiving a lot of questions already, even though this is the first time we've ever touched Blender, about how does that impact CPU. So that's going to be top of my priority list for creating a new benchmark, is how these what are these geometry nodes, how they work. So that might be different. I don't think a lot of Blender users are going to be buying Threadripper Pro, but it's there because Blender is also does GPU rendering. It doesn't do both. It's either or. Unlike V-Ray can do both at the same time. Wow. So V-Ray, even if you're doing GPU, it's still beneficial to have a high-end CPU, so that way you could have, enough PCIe lanes for 4 video cards and still get a boost for CPU rendering and throw it all together. Blender is either or, which is not too uncommon. It's usually either or. I think V-Ray, RenderMan, about the only ones that do both I can think of. I think the thought is like, normally you're going with like CUDA instruction sets for rendering, and then it's not great on CPU.
Makes sense.
Okay. And then lastly, Unreal Engine. I'm not going to go through the individual charts for all the different tests on this because they pretty much all look the same. For the CPU bound tasks of Unreal Engine, which is code compile, shader compile, baked lighting, those are all heavily threaded. Love as many cores as you can throw at it. There is some benefit to the speed, clock speed. We saw with the AMD Ryzen 5000 versus 12900K, that the 12900K actually jumped ahead in one test because of its high clock speeds, even though it had same number of cores or fewer cores. But that was just one test. And on these CPUs, they're pretty much all the same because Intel's just not even close for what they offer in this segment. And there's not a whole lot to say here.
Yeah.
So I think what's really interesting with this is like you've got like the 5950X. It's like I think a lot of people would consider a high end, and they're like, man, how much higher can you get? Like that's 3 times faster.
Yeah.
Like that is massive. Like people ask, like, wow, who's gonna invest in like Threadripper Pro? Like it doesn't make sense. Like why do that? Well, it's like, yeah, but it's 3 times faster for these guys who are like sitting there compiling shaders and waiting.
Well, yeah, because like the other day I posted on Twitter that I like was messing around with a scene in Unreal Engine and I had to recompile all the shaders. I think I was like disabled or enabled real-time ray tracing on the scene. And when you do that, it recompiles all the shaders for either ray tracing or non-ray tracing. And it was like 26,000 shaders. And it took my 5950X, I think, half an hour to compile all of them. Now, it's an asynchronous task, so I can technically still do work in the engine while it's running. It's just everything goes to the default texture, and lighting doesn't look good and everything. So it's not a great experience, and your CPU is pegged at 100% for the entire time. So yeah, at that time I was like wishing I had a Threadripper instead. But if you think about that for virtual production, you're on set with an LED wall, you have cast and crew waiting. Like, do you want them sitting around for half an hour while shaders compile because you need to update the scene? And like, you're costing yourself tens of thousands of dollars in that half an hour, and which you could have saved by having a faster CPU.
Yeah, and that's like the difference between like a 10-minute water break or 10-minute bathroom break and like a 30-minute, well, I guess we're breaking for lunch.
Yeah.
And then, people go off site and everything. It turns into an hour, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have some game developers, a large studio that we work with that they're working from home now. So they bought Threadrippers for everybody in the studio because every day, every night, the shaders are rebuilt for the entire game at the central location. Now, to get that to a user, they have two options. Either the end user recompiles shaders as needed for each level, and then only recompiles when they open those specific projects, or they share the drive data cache, which can be hundreds of gigabytes in a project that big. And then you have to like download that every morning. Like, what's worse? What's going to take more time and bandwidth and all that kind of stuff? So a lot of times they ended up going with Threadripper just to you just download the level, recompile shaders in 10 minutes, and then you're good to go for the day.
Yeah, and if you can do that in the morning, like as you're getting like ready for your day, because I know
Yeah.
my first half hour of every day is, all right, what's happened on Slack, overnight that I have to do, go through my emails and like go through my teamwork projects. So like if you could just be handling that, on that, that initial 10, 15, 24 hours,
Yeah, when I was at a game studio, that's what we'd do. We'd open up the engine and then go get our coffee, and then come back and it's ready to go. But if you have a slower CPU and it takes an hour, then that really sucks.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that's all the testing we did, right? I think that covers everything.
Much.
I mean, there's probably still a few other workflows. I mean, obviously we don't test every workflow, but
I guess
sure
the other thing,
some scientific stuff that'll be great. And
Dom seems to kind of lost any enthusiasm for CPUs.
Yeah,
he's all about GPUs now. The other thing I would say about Unreal real quick is that in this testing, I noted it in the article that I did not do FPS testing, frames per second testing, because it doesn't make any difference. And I had some questions on Facebook about why I didn't do that. So I did some testing for a guy, and I showed that in all of these resolutions, they're all the exact same. There's not any difference for your viewport performance in Unreal Engine for different CPUs. That's a game-specific thing. I might start including that chart again, just because I keep getting questions about it whenever I don't include it. Yeah.
I mean, are you going to notice? You're going to notice 320 frames versus 350 frames,
right? And the only way you're getting that is if you're going at low resolution, disabling effects and all that kind of stuff. That it's not a professional workflow. Yeah, professionals are trying to max out what's on screen at the time, and that's all GPU based, and the CPU doesn't matter.
Yeah, I know even hardware reviewers are having that problem, getting flack for it because they do CPU tests for gaming. Because I mean, honestly, a lot of those guys, I don't know, drop any YouTuber reviewer's name in there. They review CPUs, but all these games, the only way to show the difference between CPUs is by super downing the resolution and doing things that aren't realistic. And they have to do that because their livelihood is based on clicks and how many people watch their videos. And if every CPU video is just, here's a flat chart where every CPU is the same,
right,
they're just not going to get anything. So I get why they have to do it, but man, it's just in real world kind of situation on so much gaming, there are some games where it does make sense, obviously, but on a lot of those ones that they're testing, it doesn't make a lot. And same thing with your stuff. It sounds like even more so for the actual development side.
In a professional gamer in a shooter situation, there is a reason or to do that because everything happens each frame. So the faster a frame happens, the more likely when you click a button, the faster that's going to register in the computer, and then so you might be able to get an advantage on someone. That's like the pro level of a gamer. Like it's like the different Nike swimsuits or shoes or whatever that professional athletes like. Most people aren't going to run faster if you put on, those Nike shoes versus your other tennis shoes. But a professional at that level will get like a fraction of a second faster, and can make a difference for them. But yeah,
that's not what you're doing in game dev.
Yeah, that's why they sell 400 FPS or 400 hertz monitors now, and
it's crazy.
Yeah, those people in those Nike shops making the shoes don't need to be wearing Nikes.
Right.
Basically. Oh, that's probably. But yeah, with Threadripper Pro, like it's definitely an improvement over last gen. I think that's like absolutely thing. I think the other thing is, Kelly, remind me, did you ever have an instance where Xeon W was even like close to the same performance?
No.
Yeah. Okay. Me.
No, I don't think any of them.
So I don't even know. Like, William, this is probably a bad question to ask, like live on the air. Do you know what our plan is? Like, I know Threadripper Pro, we're absolutely going to be offering those as soon as we can. Xeon W, I don't think any of our recommended systems are going to be using Xeon W. Are we keeping it around for those? Because there are still some people who like needs AVX 512.
Yeah, off the top of my head, it's going to stay on some of the scientific systems. Most of the scientific ones, we offer both AMD and Intel configurations depending on what you're doing. But there are certainly some situations where Intel can make sense. Some of the instruction set stuff, and if libraries are optimized for Intel specifically, Intel's got a better compiler, I think, for some of that stuff than AMD does, that sort of thing. And then I believe right now it's on After Effects, but that will be switching with Threadripper Pro 5000. So when we switch over to that, the higher end After Effects system will move to Threadripper because of the numbers you saw. And I think it's on SolidWorks for simulation. And that's a little bit weird one. We haven't done any recent SolidWorks testing in the last few months, at least. And it did do really well on Xeon W with certain types of simulation, the ones that can use the higher cores and higher bandwidth that Xeon W and Threadripper Pro offer. But we don't have any data there saying if Threadripper Pro is better or not. That one will probably stay on Xeon W because we know it is good. And we don't want to move to something and it not be certain. So that I think that's probably the only, that and the scientific ones, I think will be the only ones on Xeon W. Which, of course, Intel will be updating that at some point. There have been rumors floating around about that, but that'll be for another live stream.
Yeah. Hopefully they'll update their socket too. But yeah, so because at this point we're like, I don't know what the percentage is. I would say like, I mean, within a few months, after Threadripper Pro 5000's launched and we've moved everything, I would say probably it's going to be like 95% of our systems are going to be either Intel Core or Threadripper Pro, right? Because like there's a few areas where like Ryzen is better than Core, but there's not many right now.
We're selling a decent number of Ryzen systems still, and that's also something AMD has said that's getting updated to the Ryzen 7000, which will be new Zen 4, I think they've said, and that'll bring them up to DDR5 memories. There's a bunch of stuff coming there at some point this year. I don't know if they've said when yet, but they announced it, I know, back earlier this year and did some teasers and stuff. So it always waffles back and forth. Every few months, a new thing comes out, it switches. That's kind of why we're here. That's why we do what we do.
All the Unreal Engine stuff is still Ryzen because the 5950 is still faster than the 12900. But below that, it kind of got a little gray. So it could have gone either way, really.
Yeah, but I mean, that makes sense for us. Like, if it gets gray, where like Intel and AMD are kind of the same at the lower levels, but then like there's one model where it's way better. Of course, we're just going to list that line. Like,
Yeah.
we don't want to have to list Core and Ryzen if we can avoid it. If they're going to be either the same or one's going to be better, then like no, just list that one. Like,
And like if you call into sales and say I'm looking for a system for Unreal Engine and I want a Intel Core, they're not going to like tell you no.
Yeah.
And be like, sure, okay,
Yeah.
whatever.
Awesome. Well, man, that brings us right on the dot. You guys, that's perfect. Right on the dot for an hour.
Unusual for labs.
Yeah, right. Good job, you guys. I'm proud of you. Actually, maybe because Don wasn't here. No, I'm just kidding. No, this was great. Is there anything else you guys want to mention or talk about before we wrap it up?
One last thing that's probably good to mention is we do have a landing page for the Ryzen 5000 WX line. So I don't know if we can drop a link in the email, but if you are interested in getting one of these, we can say that we're selling in July. Can't say exactly when, but we have a form on there. So if you're interested in getting one of these CPUs, or I mean, in a system, we're not going to sell them as a standalone, but in a system, you can just stick your name in there, and then one of our consultants will reach out as soon as we can sell them to get you right on that list. Because I really hope we'll have great supply for as much as we need, but with all the hardware shortages that have been around for the last 2 years. If you think you're going to go that way, even if you don't think it's going to be for several months, probably good to start those conversations now and get planned out, because our consultants are great. They're not going to say like, oh yeah, we can do that if we don't think we're going to have good supply. So they're very clear about how things are and how likely we're like expecting problems or that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was the only thing I was going to bring up lastly.
Right on. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today, and thank you to the audience as well. Oh, was that it? Oh, that was it then? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks, everybody, for taking time out of the day and joining us today. We've mixed up our sort of... Man, everything is starting to go out of whack. So I'll just say thanks, everybody, for joining us. Stay tuned for other episodes on Wednesdays, 1 p.m. Pacific, YouTube, Twitch. Keep an eye out on the social media stuff, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, all that good stuff. And we'll see you all next time. Bye.
See you guys.